Hello, everyone.
Hi, Rory.
How are y'all?
How are you, Rory?
I'm good. I'm good. My brain is back. I feel like I'm finally on the mend. I'm
Oh,
still a little
sorry.
tired, but I'm good.
Good.
Feeling
That's really a relief.
it's a relief to us as well, for sure. Well, while we are waiting for people to join, I want to get started because I know today we have a lot to discuss, and we are really lucky to be joined by Dr. Lisa Gunter, who is one of my personal heroes in this work and somebody who I admire greatly, who's been doing amazing work over the last few years, helping get more pets to foster and proving why this is important. Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself?
No, that was so good. I feel like you got it covered. Let's see. So my name's Dr. Lisa Gunter. I'm the Maddie's Fund Research Fellow at Arizona State University. And like Corey said, for the past couple years, we've been working on the Maddie's nationwide fostering study. And so the sort of work I'll be talking about today, the majority of that, hey Sharon, is just about various project studies within that larger study that we're carrying out to try to understand more about fostering. So everything from field trips to sleepovers to emergency fostering, and now we're working on safety net fostering. Was that good enough? Do we need more?
I think that's great. And I know Kelly has a bunch of questions, and that we all likely have a bunch of questions prepared. But you joined a Friday call, I believe, right? And everybody left with tons of questions. So thanks for joining us here as well.
Oh yeah, of course. No, it was good. I was glad folks had a lot of questions, and it seems that a lot of the questions that we had getting involved in safety net are a lot of the questions that folks have now. So hopefully we can provide some insights there. They're great questions and like good ones to tackle before getting into programming. So.
Awesome. Kelly, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I was thinking, would you be able to tell us like a little overview of safety net fostering and how you guys are working with shelters to design the programs?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can take you guys back a little bit to kind of how we decided to pivot towards this question. Like I mentioned before, we've been working with shelters for the past couple years, helping them implement fostering programs and then collecting data about those programs. So that's like the big overview of the study. So we've been helping folks do field trip programs, sleepover programs. We collected data about emergency fostering. And so in all that's about, we helped launch like over 80 programs and or collected data about them with regards to emergency fostering. And so over that time, there's definitely been questions about safety net fostering, and we'll just, we call safety net just essentially the fostering of owned animals. And there was certainly a lot of questions around it. And to be totally honest, in the beginning, when we were, looking at fostering programs for shelter dogs, when folks were like, hey, what about programs for owned dogs? We we're like, heck no way. We don't want to get into that. That's really complicated. And let's just stick with like, one unit, the shelter dog, and the other unit, the foster. Let's this is too complicated. But I had, my background is in sheltering. I worked and volunteered in sheltering for like a decade. And there were certainly programs. I remember one shelter I worked at, we had a temporary boarding program. So there's certainly interest in it. But I think the fostering piece was like the sort of, how do we do this sort of thing? And so when we started getting more questions this year, and I think, as Kelly and I chatted about for her blog, when we started getting these questions because there were concerns that if the moratorium is lifted, what are folks going to do that have pets, that are having problems finding housing, and may need more time? And so graciously, Maddie's fund allowed us to pivot and ask these questions about programs, programs. And like I said, kind of got the fostering bit of it.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you could mute, make sure you mute yourself. We're getting a lot of feedback. Thank you.
I think I muted them. That was wild.
Rory just like, it's like, shut it down. So when we decided to pivot to this question, we had a lot of questions around like, how do you work with owners? What about liability? I mean, those were a couple of the really big ones. And so what we did for a couple months is that we just carried out investigative interviews, and we talked to organizations that were working with owners and their pets. And it was programs in sheltering, like temporary boarding programs, but then it was also organizations outside of sheltering that were working with, say, military pets of the military, as well as survivors of domestic violence. And so it was really learning from all of those sort of organizations what was working for them, but also we talked to programs that weren't doing as well as they wanted to be, and we looked for common themes about perhaps what was related to their lack of success so far. And so it was through all of that, then through all of those interviews, we collected a lot of information. We also collected a lot of documents, and that's how we put together our training on safety net fostering. So for all the shelters that participate in the study, that training, which is 3 days, it's about 2.5 hours every day. That's really what gives shelters the bulk of the knowledge, and particularly documents and templates and stuff like that. And then it's from there that then we, as soon as shelters join the study and they fill out the paperwork and they join the training, after that we're chatting with shelters every single week on weekly Zoom calls until they launch their program, which we give a 1.5-month window. And then once they launch, throughout data collection, we're meeting with them every single week as well. And a lot of that is providing programmatic support as well as the data collection. So that's sort of a little bit. Did I actually answer the question, Kelly? Did I answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. I was like, shoot, I did not.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier doing surveys of the fosters, and you had some really interesting data from that. If you would share.
Yeah. So for all of the shelters that join our study, we've created what we're calling our foster interest survey. And this was actually really created as a tool for the shelters, less about like us maybe actually being able to publish this data, but it's been really interesting about what we're finding. So one of the things that we always chat about with shelters when they join the study is that, we really want to kind of poke and make sure that they're ready for it, because, we always like to say, like, yes, we're not completely altruistic. It's not like, we're all about the program. We are, but we also need data. We're scientists. But at the end of the day, if shelters don't have a program, how are we ever going to collect data from them? So one big component of this is having the foster homes. And so to kind of learn more about existing foster caregivers, as well as folks that are volunteers and not necessarily fostering yet, sending out an interest survey to learn more about not only their role in the shelter, but their interest in the program. And we actually created that survey to be anonymous so that we could get really honest feedback. Certainly if they want to participate and foster, like, we want to get that information so we can get back in touch with them. But we really wanted to provide folks that were hesitant about doing this an opportunity to express their opinions. And one of the things that we found in the survey was that, when we asked like what's like their motivation for being interested, certainly the most often provided reason was that they, wanted to help this pet, right? And they wanted, and that's not surprising, right? We have a whole bunch of foster caregivers and volunteers from an animal shelter, and they're worried about the pet's welfare. But the really cool thing we found is that, so that was like around 75%, but a little over 70% of folks were like, they wanted to keep the pet with the family, and that family piece was really important. And so that was, I think, really exciting for us, because, I think that gives us a window that, there are a lot of folks that bond is important, and it's not just about the pet, right? Which it makes sense that the pet piece would be higher with folks that are currently involved in foster caregiving and volunteering. But I think that I think we were all really happy to see that so many people wanted to keep pets with their families. And I think that's something that we can certainly, grow on, and how we can, help market these type of programs.
Awesome. So does anyone here have a program, and is anyone here involved with the study? And do you have any questions for Dr. Gunter?
There are some questions in the chat about liability, and I'm wondering, yeah, what answers you have around sort of liability for programs like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big one. If I saw correctly, I didn't know if there was some. Yeah. Anyway, whatever. I think there's some shelters that we're working with that are on this call or we've talked to, and I think in terms of the liability thing, I think yes, that is something that we absolutely have to address. But I think it's not insurmountable, and the ways in which we can do it are in the agreement that we have with the owner and the shelter. And within that, there's a lot of different ways that you can do it, but certainly having a piece in the agreement, and there's likely multiple pieces, and you want to have your legal look over it. But one of them is that the pet may not be returned in the same condition as it went into the program, and that the owner does sign off on that, and that could be medical, that could be behavioral, and so I think that in itself is really important. I think it's certainly having conversations with owners. What about if a medical procedure has to happen, and making sure that that's okayed ahead of time, that if something happens to the pet while in foster care and it needs some sort of emergency care, that they can be provided for. But like I said, that's sort of another thing that shelters have added is doing an intake exam when the animal enters the program. So they have a baseline about the animal's medical, the animal's behavioral. And so that's also, I think, a really great idea. And so I think that that's where, because one of the ways, there's a couple different ways that you can go about running these programs. And one of them is that the animal is surrendered to the shelter. And certainly that is a way to get around that liability piece, because the pet is no longer the property of the owner, and it's being cared for by the shelter. But in our opinion, I think if we can avoid that, because I think it can be potentially traumatizing to somebody who's already going through like a traumatic situation, if they're having to, even temporarily not care for their pet and whatever other things are going on in their lives, that if we can instead keep the pet as owned by the owner and get all the information that we need about the pet, like we would in an owner surrender profile, and make sure we have language in the agreement that protects the shelter from anything that would happen to the pet, that I think is the better route to go, if we can. And I know in some shelters that's not an option, but I think if we can, it's a good way to go. Does that answer the question? I hope it does.
So we have a question. What about organizations that don't have legal staff to look things over? And also, do the documents that you guys have they been looked over by legal staff and stuff?
So yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so that's the thing so what we encourage all the shelters that are in our study, because we don't know the local sort of municipal, maybe laws or anything around these type of things, and they can be different state to state, municipality to municipality. We encourage all of our shelters to have them looked over. The ones that we've developed, we've taken them from from versions from other organizations. So it's a good starting point, but certainly we can't know about every area, and so it's a good idea to have it checked out for sure. Yeah, but I think that is sort of tough if you don't have people on board. That it might be a good idea to consult even on something like this. But certainly, if you probably have adoption contracts and all of that, there's got to be some point in time that you had a legal person, legal representation take a look over it, and those are probably the folks you want to talk to again, just to make sure you've covered everything, specifically, especially for your own municipality. I think for some of the shelters we're working with in California, for example, they've been particularly sensitive about that, and so at least in the study for our shelters, we're like, hey, this is a starting point. If you want to add anything to it because you don't feel like something's clear enough or something hasn't been addressed, absolutely do so.
Dr. Gunter, Jen Browse has a good question that I might touch on, but I was going to ask, we're talking about liability waivers and agreements and whatnot. Have you encountered and do you recommend that there be an agreement between the pet owner and the foster caregiver separate from whatever agreements are in place with the shelter organization?
So we haven't gone that route, and I think that it would, how we've structured these programs is such that unless it's at the end of the program and the owner wants to have contact with the foster, we're not really doing that contact piece until the end, and it's consented by both parties, and really trying to keep the agreement with the shelter and the owner so that there isn't a foster person that may kind of get stuck in the middle of it, particularly, with regards to the communication piece. And so I think, in our opinion, it was important to kind of set that boundary right away, that this is between the shelter and the owner. But certainly at the end, if they want to meet, and we've heard some great stories about that it's consenting on both parts, and it's the end of the program. I think because some of these programs are taking on pets that are owned by survivors of domestic violence, there are some programs that have that component. We've always kind of really maintained this privacy piece.
Okay, so maybe we'll be changing in the next few weeks.
There's a whole bunch of questions in the chat. Brittany, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it was just, I wanted to see if we could get a little bit more of an explanation on how the medical piece works. So I'm wondering, if a medical emergency happens or something with the animal is happening medically, what is the agreement? Is it that the owner pays, or what are the resources for that? How does that piece work?
I think, to be just totally frank about that, I think if somebody, and we don't know what sort of, income situation this any folks that access this program are where they're at. But I think to be mindful of the broad range of situations people are coming from, I think it's probably, I don't think, we're not recommending that owners be required to pay any sort of medical bills. I think that can get pretty challenging quickly, and I think another reason why, I mean, we just don't want barriers in the program at all for people accessing it. But I think the other piece of it is that if our foster interest survey is any indication about how much people in the shelter want to keep people and pets together, I don't think it would be difficult to have a fund for medical expenses for pets that enter this program in case something emergent happens. I think that there seems to be a lot of support for it. So I do think, though, and this is something that we brought up with other shelters that have joined the study, is that it would probably be worthwhile to come up with a matrix about like what things you all will treat and what you won't, and that probably needs to be spelled out to the owners so they have an expectation if something that the shelter wouldn't treat because of cost or outcome or et cetera, that the owner is aware of those situations. So I think it does behoove us to have a matrix about conditions and care. Yeah.
Absolutely. Jen Browse, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, I was just suggesting, I guess, can the government agencies who are concerned about the liability just take them in as surrender? And the reason that I'm suggesting is because that's what we did. So, for 15 years, we have helped people in that way where, they're coming in anyway, one way or another, right? So they're coming in from police and fire after a fire situation, and the owners rush to the hospital, the animal's coming in. We're caring for it, hoping to connect to the owner. Sometimes it stays at the shelter, sometimes it might go to foster care, and then the owner gets involved again, and then we reunite them. So we're trying to not look at it any differently than that. The difference for us is we're thinking about it more often and as a prevention for intake versus like it would have come in anyway. So now you're thinking about surrendering it because you've lost your home, or you're moving, or you're evicted, or whatever. And if we have that conversation and you think you could get your pet back, then we're gonna still have you surrender it to us, but we're gonna give you now this other document that says, this is how we're gonna work for you. Here's the expectations we have of you, and here's what you can expect of us. But it is up to us on what happens to that animal, because it's legally surrendered over to us. And that's how we're looking at it, just like it would have come in through these other scenarios. And so, yes, we're a nonprofit, but we have a contract to operate the city shelter, and animal control works in the same building as us. We take in everything that they pick up. But that's how we're kind of getting around some of that liability issue. And also, what if you can't reach the owner? You have an emergency situation, you can't reach the owner. They need to understand that we're limited on the resources we can provide. They have to know that they need to be available. We have to have a phone number or an email or some way to contact them so that we can talk quickly about, can you afford this? Can we afford that? And we know most of the time they can't. So then they have to understand we're going to have to act on behalf of what's best for the animal or what we can afford to do, especially if we can't reach them. So that's our workaround for it.
Yeah, I think from our experience, that's a really common workaround and I think that if that's the holdup for like doing a program, is this like you can't get agreement that like is satisfying everyone in the shelter, certainly doing it this way is much better than not doing it at all. So I think it's a great workaround. And certainly in the and I can talk more about this, but certainly like in the agreement portion, one of the non-negotiables in our study and we have a handful of non-negotiables that the shelters that participate in the study have to do as part of the study to keep things consistent. And one of them is weekly contact. And so when the agreement is completed by both the owner and the shelter, one component of that is when they are going to chat each week. And it's not a, hey, we'll just chat each week, because we know that there could be folks accessing this program or being part of this program, participating, that having some sort of a device to communicate on, like a phone, may be challenging, or having regular access to it. So having a day and either morning or afternoon is a way that we can both like have schedules and like have like a time that it's agreed upon that makes it most likely that folks will chat, as well as providing an emergency contact, because that emergency contact is part of our contingency piece. If we lose, which I showed up in the chat a bit, if we lose contact with an owner, and what we try to attempt to get back in contact before we send a breach of contract to them. So, yeah. Not sure that's helpful.
Kathy, did you have a question?
My apologies. Didn't have the screen up. So just to Jen's point and to some of the stuff that's been going back and forth in the chat between Lisa and Chris and whatnot, we have some competing issues. It seems like we're a municipally run shelter. Our veterinary group is regulated by a third party, not even technically a provincial organization, but it sort of comes out of the provincial legislation. And so we've been talking to organizations that are working out of the Professional Veterinary Association, running a safe pet program for victims of domestic violence, and how do they handle this medical authority piece, because we're really trying not to have the people surrender the pet if possible, because of the fact that it's just adding to the stress level. So I mean, I'm fine to do a lot of this stuff that we're talking about, absolutely. I just have this nasty voice in my head from the people in risk management in City Hall who go, "You mean you want to bring people in the building to touch the pets?" when we talk to them about a humane education piece. I'm like, we're an animal shelter. What do you think they do when they come here? So if I go ahead and do this kind of stuff and I don't get the animal surrendered because I'm trying to avoid that, which is what the safe pet people are doing. They seem to have better contact maybe with people. To Jen's point, we're not talking just about people in intimate partner violence situations where they're going to a shelter that we know about. We're talking about people that have been incarcerated, that are in hospital, that we can make every effort to try and reach. First, we need to know where they actually went. So that can be the challenge. And I'm just trying to see, is there, which there doesn't seem to be, an okay, fine, is there sort of a one size fits all, this is going to work? But it's a piece that I will also carry forward here in Canada and Ontario at the provincial and national level for future discussion with veterinarian regulatory bodies. They talk about the VCPR, and that's what gives the authority to the veterinarian. And I'm going to push them and say there needs to be some other sort of in between realm, because these situations arise. And whatever treatment we're looking at providing, the shelter wants to provide something, and we don't want to be doing it and not be in compliance. So I'm not sure that was a question, but thanks, Kelly.
I think one piece to sort of follow up on Kathy's comment, which I think was really insightful, is that one of the biggest things that we talk about in forced shelters, the very first part of training is about eligibility criteria and who are we going to work with and how are we going to work with them. And that's the conversation that you've got to be having with everybody in your org, and what are folks comfortable with on a medical side, the medical needs of the pet, like as entering the program, what behavioral needs, I know that came up in the chat as well. And then, how are we going to structure this program? I think all of the, what situations are owners that they're currently in are we going to work with? And the biggest thing that we talk about with all of our shelters is be conservative in the beginning, go with work with cases, and we talk about cases that are supported. Those are situations where folks are already working with a case manager or a social worker from another organization. That those are the types of cases you really want to be taking on first if you can. And of course, there's going to be some that fall around the edges, but that when you're first getting started, what we saw conversely when shelters were struggling with these programs is that, and by struggling, and this is not necessarily a failure, but pets not reuniting, that's not necessarily a failure. And I want to be really clear about that, because I think for the individual, it may be the best choice, but I think it can be sometimes disheartening for staff that is a goal of the program. And when it doesn't happen a lot, it can be like, well, why are we doing this? Like they end up just being surrendered anyway. But so I do think that working with folks that have a case manager, have a social worker, and then really on a case-by-case basis, taking on unsupported cases, I think that's the way to go to, to avoid compassion fatigue, to, really have to build a program that has longevity, and also ideally have a program that's referral based if we can. I think referral based programs certainly help with one piece of this, which if you have a social worker in that running the program that is trained in social work, that's fantastic. But many of the shelters that we're working with don't have someone with that skill set yet. I hope that's changing, but not yet. And so that's where I think is a piece that we can bridge where our skill sets lie and what cases we work with that work best with the skill set of the shelter.
Henry Shortliff, you had some really good questions in the chat. Do you want to ask them?
Okay, got it off mute. I was having some technical issues, so let's see if video will help me work out. Okay, I did have a few questions, and I think you talked about a breach of contract being an answer to one of the questions, and that would be for safety net fosters who end up maybe like stuck with an animal. There's a loss of communication. So I think you've answered that question, but my question was around if somebody ends up kind of stuck with an animal. Secondly, I was wondering if there's behavioral assistance for your programs for anyone who's wanting to continue fostering an animal, but sort of experiencing some issues fostering the animal, but they want to work through them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess a couple different things on that. I have so many things to say because I'm a behaviorist, so you're just gonna have to shut me up. But what are some things I can say about it? I think first and foremost, when back earlier last year when we were helping shelters with emergency fostering data collection, I think one of the really awesome things that we talk about silver linings of the pandemic, fostering, being one of them. But I think the other thing is that we can use Zoom to provide behavioral support and really connecting with people. And I think that that's something that we likely need to do more of, to have essentially like behavior roundtables where maybe there is a discussion about a general topic, and then offering a Q&A up for our fosters that if they have behavioral questions. I think that helps us deal with these sort of situations maybe before they get to a point that they might be sort of difficult to deal with. So that would be sort of number one, and I would really encourage any shelters to give that a try to see what sort of reception they get from their fosters about that sort of availability of behavioral information. I think number two, when we talk about what happens about problems in the home behaviorally, and I think just to take a little step back on that, I think one of the things that we've been working on is really trying to keep the sort of the foster caregivers' interest in fostering foremost in our mind. And I spoke a little bit about this, I think, on the call on Monday. But one of the things that we learned when doing foster satisfaction surveys during our emergency fostering data collection is that we found that foster caregivers, when we asked them, this was after fostering, so this wasn't like a before thing, this was after having fostered. We said, well, what's your ideal duration of fostering? And we found that it was actually quite a bit shorter than we thought it was going to be, that it was, depending on the shelter, somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks. And so when we think about that duration, I think that is, and then we think, safety net, which could be maybe up to 3 months. How do we put those two things together if perhaps fosters aren't going to want to do it as long as would be helpful to kind of minimize the number of homes? And so one of the things that we've been talking about with all of our shelters that join the study, and they certainly don't have to do this, but is how do we help listen to our fosters and do it in a way that they don't kind of have to be the bad guy and say, hey, I'm done with this. Like, I really want to help this owner, but I'm kind of done with it. And so what we're encouraging the shelters to do, which is going to sound so counterintuitive, and I don't even know if anybody's going to like this idea on the call, but what we're encouraging is that they offer an opt-out feature. And that every couple weeks, right, if we know that that's maybe the amount of time that folks want to be like, hey, how are things going? Are you done? Or do you want to keep on going? Instead of them having to come to you and say, no, I'm done, and be the bad guy. Instead, we kind of broach that subject for them, and then they have choice and control to say, no, this is good. And that is a way to kind of reinforce also their commitment to the animal and their connection and willingness to participate in the program, is that then they get to say, versus sort of this non-talked about conversation that they're just going to foster until it's done. Instead, it's a conversation we have on a regular basis. And if it's not a good fit behaviorally, we can remove the animal. But I also think that providing behavioral support and even potentially, using Zoom and other technologies to help address some problems that they're having. I think it's a little complicated doing in-home stuff during the pandemic, but I think if some cases, particularly with aggression, can be complicated, that I think that doing something more in person might be needed. But I think that there's a lot of ways of how we place, how we match make, how we place, how we keep animals in homes, and then how we're supporting them during their stay that hopefully can address the behavioral stuff.
That's really helpful. Thanks so much.
You guys have so many great questions. Rose, do you want to ask your question? Rose?
Hi. Oh, is it working? Yeah, so I was wondering, because I know we'll definitely want to do a behavior assessment on animals that are going to go into this program, because we want to get a better idea of what they're going to be like. Do you recommend that these behavior assessments be done prior to the animal coming into the shelter and then going to fostering? Or have you seen a better outcome when they stay a couple of days and get assessed by a behavior team?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I think that what we're encouraging shelters to do is that the application that the shelters that are participating in the study, everyone uses the same thing so that we can get information about the owners, because we want to know who's accessing this program. But one of the things is that information about the pet. And so I think having been around this question a bit in terms of my work in the shelter, as well as our work in other fostering studies like our sleepover study, I think that there certainly is a real value about in-home, like information from a home, because the pets are going from a home to another home. And so certainly there are a lot of different environmental conditions between homes, which could bring about different behavior. But I think at least in the home, we get a good idea of what they're going to be like. And hopefully, and the idea is that also if you do I think one of the things to sort of think about, and I'll just throw this out there, is that certainly, again, I'm a behaviorist, so collecting behavior information is awesome and I love it. But I think that, in terms of what we get when the pet comes in with the owner to participate in the program, there's a lot that we can get in our interactions with them, and with, like, if we're going to do a medical exam, that isn't really necessary to do a standalone behavior assessment if we have a lot of information from the owner and we use our intake process to collect behavioral information about how the animal is with handling and that sort of thing. I think there's a lot of real world stuff that we can get and should be recording I think that's, in my opinion, that's often our issue, is not that we don't have all these real life situations that we could be collecting behavioral information. We are noticing, we're just not recording. So I think recording more of that would probably help. But certainly that, initial, when the person is applying for the program, we learn a lot about the pet, that we can start thinking about foster matches then, collect additional information upon intake with the animal, and then hopefully getting them out into foster care pretty quickly within like a day or two, because you already lined up the foster home. And I think that that's going to help reduce the stress for the animal and transitioning from a home. I think that's probably going to be more helpful for them if we can do it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Lauren, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, well, Brad kind of answered what I was specifically getting at, which is the alternative to owner surrender and providing vet care. Our organization historically has only offered owner surrender, and of course, we'd like to look at other alternatives. But I guess, are there any other considerations for the non-owner surrender option in terms of decision making for the pet?
Like, what kind of situations are you thinking about? I feel like you might have something in mind.
I aside from vet care, I really can't think of anything. I guess just exploring this whole notion of not surrendering and kind of any liabilities that might come up there.
I mean, no, for sure. I mean, I do think that thinking about medical and behavior in both of them is important, because I think that there could be behavioral changes with the pet. It's a potentially stressful time for them. They're going to a new home, and there's also interactions with the pet and other pets potentially in the foster home. So my thoughts would be about including both of them. And also, like Chris mentions, that there's the dog bite thing. There's also property damage. And unfortunately, this is not hasn't happened during our study, but unfortunately, there have been situations when we've talked to other shelters where the pet has escaped and it can't be found. And so I think that is something to consider, that they could escape a yard. And so those type of things, I think, do need to be considered for sure.
Thank you.
Certainly. Erica, you had a couple questions.
Or I don't know if that was like a vent session or actual questions.
No, interesting ones.
I feel like we've had those worst case scenarios, and it's I was with another organization and we did try it a couple times, and the one dog got hit by a car and needed thousands of dollars worth of orthopedic surgery, and the other dog severely bit the foster. It was just like, so you get a couple of those back to back. And so we have tried it at our organization. I've personally taken in a few fosters because we weren't 100% on letting our volunteer fosters do it. And in one situation, my foster went back to the owner and was hit by a car and killed within 2 weeks of going back. So it's like all these really negative stories sort of compound things. But my point is that we struggle with so many people that just got a pet. I can't tell you how many people have already reached out to us, just got a pet during the pandemic, when they were already unemployed and already couch surfing and that kind of thing. And how much commitment do we have to people that don't have a bond, have never taken it to a vet, have not done any training with it? And then the flip side is, how much do we do with the dog that's on the chain that might be their only option? And certainly adoption is not an option. Sorry for the barking pain. He's looking out the window.
Can I just comment on something Erica said in the chat about people being reluctant, foster parents being reluctant to return pets to a situation that they don't think is ideal. And I think it's worth, at least in our case, we select and train the foster parents for this program very differently than the foster parents for shelter animals, because the animals come to us in less than perfect condition, from less than perfect circumstances, and they're going to return possibly to less than perfect circumstances. And you really need foster parents who are not going to be judgmental and understand that that's an important difference in the animals that you're seeing. We combine, I mean, we do both foster and in shelter, depending on circumstances for these programs, but we don't tend to place animals in this program into foster with people who we don't have a history with, or more of a history than maybe the shelter animal fosters.
Yeah, I think that's all. Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, Brad. Like, that's absolutely what we're, that's why, like, when we did that foster interest survey, it was of existing folks. And I think that certainly when you're just getting your feet off the ground with a program like this, I think that it's nice too that you'll have fosters that you have a relationship with, that feedback, you can kind of qualify that feedback because you've had feedback with them before, that you can kind of understand their responses and whether they like the program, whether they don't like the program, or bits and pieces that you need to change. You've got a baseline there because they fostered for you before. I think one of the nice things that we've seen, at least, and again, I think it's challenging because it is a survey. We keep it anonymous. But still, I think there's always hesitation to sometimes express not very popular views. But that sort of like judgment piece around differences in standards of care, or the care that an animal receives perhaps in the home prior and then part of the program, and that being a sort of, are we going to let the pet go back type ideas, that in the survey, we didn't get a lot of responding about that, and less so than we anticipated. I'm not to say it's not out there, but I think the sort of, and who's to say what's going to happen when you're actually with a pet and you've bonded with it and then returning to its home. But I think that using some sort of interest survey where you get to take the temperature and figure out what are the particular issues in your organization that, like someone said in chat, staff or fosters, maybe we want to have more education around. I think we can kind of tailor our sort of education of our fosters, volunteers, and staff based around maybe some responding on some of these surveys, so we can figure out what are the pressure points and try to address them. But like you said, Brad, I think that's a really great idea to have specific training for this type of caregiving.
Absolutely. Sharon, you had a question. I wasn't entirely sure if you could clarify, if you don't mind.
You mean about the Fast 15
Yeah.
foster assessment?
Mm-hmm.
I just wasn't sure if this, and I know Lisa knows about that, if this is the scenario where this assessment could help, or was that set up differently? I was just curious if that was would help organizations understand where their fosters are, or if there's another tool.
Ooh.
I think the Fast 15 is a survey that that you send out, annually or so to evaluate how people are with the foster program you have. So I don't think it would necessarily tell you anything about people's interest in safety net foster. However, you would be able to see if your fosters feel like they're being supported and that type of thing.
Interesting.
And I guess the reason I was questioning it or asking it was, could it be used for a subgroup, a before and a middle and after for the program? I'm not sure. And I think, Kelly, you might know more about that. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it could. To see where people are at and to see how that has changed over time. Definitely.
Where can we learn about that? I don't know about that, and I'd love to learn more about that.
Oh, I will put a link in the chat.
I was just looking it up. I have the link if you want.
Awesome. I know, I'm like, what is that? That sounds amazing.
Thank you. It's basically like a free assessment tool.
Sharon, you were much too generous for me. I had to look it up too. So I'm so embarrassed now.
No, that's okay. It gets sent out. We send it out to the shelters from time to time because we help sponsor the creation of it. And that just gives me a lot of good information that we need to maybe share a little bit more about it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really cool tool because it does show you kind of where your organization is on a scale, which is really interesting. Let's see, more questions.
Oh, sorry about that. My notification. I can't believe this hour is almost
right?
up. It's flown by. It's been really wonderful to have you here today, Lisa. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's been a good time. The questions are so good. I hope I answered them, gave enough info, but folks are totally welcome to reach out to us. And also, like, if you're, we're still looking for a few shelters to join the study. I think we're chatting with Chris and their shelter. So, if folks are interested, reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in chat. And if you're a shelter, if you're thinking about getting a program off the ground, or it's kind of nascent and you've had a few cases, but you'd like the kind of structure of the study as well as the data collection piece, please get in touch with us because we'd love to have you.
Where can we learn more about your study?
Oh, yeah, good question. We always send out little emails. We're an invite only sort of club. No, kidding, sort of not kidding. But I can actually, you know what I can? Oh yeah, Janelle. Yeah, we have a call with you guys this week, so I'm looking forward to seeing Chris and Janelle. I have a kind of PDF of like the study timeline and what's required to join the study and like what kind of our expectations are during the study, and I could share that with you all, and then maybe you could send it out to the group. Would that be possible, Rory?
Yeah, absolutely. If you send it to me, I can send it to people that are on this call. And
okay, great. Yeah. Well,
yeah, I guess I have a question which is just sort of my own personal interest. But what has been most surprising to you with all of this that you've learned?
About safety net. I don't know. I think I'm going to be slightly sappy here, so I hope this is that I'm allowed to be like this. But I would say that I'm really excited about the future of sheltering. I think when Brad brought up the point about fosters having a hard time sending pets back to homes that might be different than their own. It reminded me of when I got into sheltering during Hurricane Katrina and having a case just like that. And I think while we still struggle, I think with those judgments around differences in living condition, I just think sheltering is changing so much, and we're getting to get out of the shelter and we're getting to help people where they're at. And I think, when we saw that foster interest survey and so many folks were saying they wanted to keep people and pets together, I think that gives us so much hope for the future that we get to not just work in the shelter, but get to work out in the community. And I'm really excited about that.
I love that. That's great.
It's awesome. You're about to make me cry.
I know, me too. Does anyone have any last minute questions? We have about 7 minutes left. Are there any other questions? All right, I have another one, which is how do you pitch this idea to staff, to city council, to your board of directors? How would you recommend just having all these questions come up around liability? I'm wondering what's the pitch?
What's the pitch? Oh, when we talk to shelters about joining the study or starting a program? I think we try to have all the stakeholders in the room, the folks that could have some concerns. And so that, does involve a lot of folks on these phone calls when we're first chatting with shelters. And we really I think we lay it out there. I think because we I'd like to think we spent the time trying to learn how to do these programs from a vast array of organizations, and that the training is reflective of best practices, and that we're trying to take those best practices and make them evidence-based best practices, and that shelters can be a part of that, and that they get so much support. I think that that's something that we come back to again and again, is that, you know, I think that there is no shortage of folks in sheltering that are just trying to change the world and trying to make things better for pets and people. But it's a bandwidth issue oftentimes, that there's so many things to do. And so I think, you know, having the support of our team for essentially 6 months, where they get phone calls every single week with the folks on our team, and helping them troubleshoot, and just being a support system to overcoming organizational barriers. Yes, there's the data collection bit, but it's a lot of programmatic support. I think that that's kind of, that whole sort of kit and caboodle is how we pitch it. And I think if you're trying to get a program off the ground, you know, it's going to be great to do it with some support, instead of going alone as a single person trying to reinvent everything, you know, trying to recreate the wheel. You don't have to.
And I was going to say, during the short-term foster portion of the study, when we were doing the training, so many people were telling me that they, you know, their administration or their county government might be uncomfortable with it, but it's a study. So it kind of gave them like buy-in, like this is scientific. And, you know, it really, just being in the study was a huge way to motivate people to be comfortable with it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a good point. I kind of forget about that, because that's like the hat I'm wearing all the time. But yeah, plenty of our shelters were able to kind of use that to kind of get sort of progressive, like, social cred. Hey, like, we're on the cutting edge of science, of what's happening in sheltering. And, you know, this is our organization. Like, you know, we're really trying to change things. I think that can be really effective for some organizations, for 100%. Yes, I will come to any and all meetings. You can actually ask Brenda about that, if Brenda Barrett is still on the call, that I did come to a city council meeting for them when they were talking about removing breed labels. So I do make even in-person appearances occasionally, but Zoom might have to stand for right now.
And she can sell anything to your board that you need. She can sell it to your board if you need an advocate.
Thanks, Brenda.
Amazing. I love it.
Good thing for Zoom, because you can come to Canada easily then.
I know. I'm so excited. I don't go to Canada enough, so it's all this virtual travel now. I'll have to be okay with that until we get to travel again.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Kelly, for setting this up. And thank you, Dr. Gunter, for being here with us today. Really awesome conversation. And if you send anything over to me, I'll make sure to get it out to the group. And same goes for anybody else who wanted to share with this group. I'm going to try to start getting those emails out by Friday. So if you send me everything by tomorrow, I'll get those resources out to you all on Friday. Next week, we have Kelly coming to talk about foster care, more foster care. Kelly, do you want to give a brief intro about that?
Yeah, we're going to talk about foster-centric sheltering and the biggest challenges that organizations are running into, and how you might be able to get prevent them. I'm going to see if we can get some of our foster working group involved as well. So excited.
And then the following week, we have Kristen coming from the executive committee to talk about our strategic plan moving forward for human and animal support services. So that should be a good call as well. Thank you again, Dr. Gunter. It's been so nice to see you, and wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. Invite me back anytime.
Awesome. We will do that. Talk soon, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.